Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. This is going to be the repo we're going to be working out of. You don't have to go there right now. I'll put this back up in a minute, but in case for some of you who wanted to get started, you can go over there. But we'll get to that. You are here at PyCon 2023 to attend Building a Python-backed Frontend with HTMX and Tailwind CSS. So if you're not here to attend this tutorial, you may have wandered into the wrong room. But hopefully, we're all ready to go. Let me just get this. Quick introduction. My name's Mario. I am not a software engineer by trade. I'm a business analyst. I do try to sprinkle in some Python into my day-to-day from time to time. But most of my Pythoning is done in the off hours. Between my wife and 4-year-old who are there in the back, that tends to happen at night. So I have this blog, Python by Night. That's what I try to do in the evenings. Now, we have a lot to get through today, so I just want to get right into it. I'm going to show you how to build something really cool. We're going to use this tech stack, which we'll keep coming back to. Now, FastAPI is the web framework I've used in the past. I've used Django for a couple projects. You don't have to have FastAPI experience to kind of get through this. We'll just be using some features, but hopefully if you have any sort of experience with any other web framework, you'll be right at home. We're going to use Jinja for templating. It's very similar to Django templates if you've used those in the past, and of course if you come from Flask, you're pretty familiar with those. Tailwind CSS is the utility-first CSS framework that we're going to be talking about. Very awesome, it gets you going really quickly. I'm super excited about that. And of course, HTMX, which brings all these awesome modern browser features directly into your HTML. So that's super exciting. That's going to be our tech stack. I haven't talked about a little piece. We are going to be using a library called TinyDB. It's a very small, it's meant to emulate a basic database layer. If you've used any other ORM, whether it's from Django's side or something like SQL Alchemy, that's usually what you'd put in place of that. TinyDB is just it uses a JSON file. It's the local database, kind of like TinyDB. So without, what you didn't see there is you didn't see any JavaScript. We're not going to be using any JavaScript. Now, the intention here is to reduce as much complexity in the building of your web application. So we're going to get rid of that, and we're only going to be using hypertext. Now, I know that sounds kind of like a retro science fiction term. That's probably because it is. I think it was coined back in the 60s. Now, the idea of that is that text is displayed with these hyperlinks, and ordinarily that's linking to data that's in a database. And that's kind of where the concept of the World Wide Web came from the idea of hypertext. And that's what HTMX embraces. And then we use Tailwind CSS to style that up for us. And we don't put in that client-side JavaScript layer. Now, Tailwind CSS, again, you use these utility classes to style up your HTML. Now, if you don't know too much about it, there are somewhat valid criticisms that it makes it looks a lot like inline styles. If you've used HTML and you're kind of putting inline styles and then they get really, really long, it does make your HTML look a little busier. And at first, it starts seeming a little repetitive. But what you'll find is when you're styling strictly from your HTML and you're not going to a separate file, to a CSS file, it will dramatically increase your productivity. And it remains fairly lean because you're compiling at build time. You're only compiling a CSS file to use that's based on the classes that you're using. You're not bringing in this huge framework and then picking and choosing and leaving it in your design. And because these utility classes are already preset, it allows for a very consistent design pattern. And also it helps to think of responsive design from the very beginning. It's very easy to bring in some responsive features. Now, HTMX, I'm super excited about HTMX. It allows you to make requests from any HTML element. So usually, you use a form or an input element, and you hit submit. That sends a post request to, to the server, or you're using hyperlinks, send a GET request. But with HTMX, you can send a GET request, a POST request, delete any of those HTTP verbs from any element. You can send it from a div element, from a paragraph element, and you can define what triggers to use, whether it's a mouse over or a click or a key press, all sorts of cool stuff with no JavaScript. You're just putting it right in the HTML, and then from the server side, you're just receiving that request and sending back the response that replaces only that DOM element. So you're not doing a full page refresh, you're just refreshing that one element or a separate target element that you define within the HTMX call. So all without leaving the comfort of HTML. You could be doing all of this, the Tailwind stuff, the HTMX stuff, all within your HTML. You can see how quickly you can get through prototyping and designing your website. So we're going to build a pretty simple website, I'd call it. Now, I generally don't like the word simple because simple for some might not be so simple for others. And the usage here with me, it's kind of ironic. The sense is that we're trying to reduce complexity, and that is definitely something that we're doing when we're getting rid of JavaScript in our build process. So in other words, if you're already familiar with HTML markup, then HTMX fits right into that paradigm without much more mental overhead, trying to learn a new framework or another front-end library. So the complexity of the behavior then is sent to the back end, which is something that hopefully we're all comfortable with in the Python sphere. You're doing all that logic on the server side. So the loops you see here playing is kind of how I started this project as a simple site where it starts with just a very basic ugly HTML page that just starts being built up little by little. Now, where we pick up is at the tail end of this so that we can really just get into the features of Tailwind and HTMX. So that's where we're going to start today. But a little bit of housekeeping before we jump right in. If you have questions, you'll notice that I put some post-it notes in between any of the tables where you'll be sitting. Those post-it notes are there to help you if you have any questions. What I want you to do is take one of those post-it notes and just put it on the corner of your laptop like this so I can see that you have a question. The reason for that is sometimes when you have a question, you might be thinking something, but you don't want to lower your hand to type. So that way you can keep typing, troubleshooting through whatever question you might have. You might even find out while you're typing, at which point you can just take your tab off. But that'll help me see, maybe a lot of people have questions. We can stop back. I can step back. So I'll either answer your questions from up here, or I'll walk by if it seems like it's something you just kind of need assistance with. I'll be happy to walk by. So with all that said, are there any questions so far? All right, let's dive right in. We want to set up your environment. That's usually the most important part when we're getting ready with a tutorial. This is, again, the repo we'll be using. I have it both as a bit.ly link or fully typed out there. If you want to go ahead and navigate to that. There are a couple ways to set up your environment. If you've done tutorials in the past, sometimes it involves just cloning the repo, pulling it locally, setting up your environment. That's the traditional route. If you're comfortable doing it that way, you can go ahead and do it that way. I recommend to use code spaces. Code spaces is a newish feature with GitHub. You do have to have a GitHub account, so if you do not have a GitHub account, you'd probably want to just go a separate route. But with GitHub, there is a feature called code spaces. Now, what code spaces does is it containerizes the entire repo. I think it uses Docker, but it doesn't matter because it's all on the cloud. And that's pretty much it. You get it started, it containerizes the repo, puts it in the cloud, and then it gives you, I think it's 60 hours per month, thereabouts, to kind of play around with it. You don't have to install dependencies, you don't have to activate environments. It's all within the browser. It's VS Code-like, so if you're used to using VS Code, you can just go right in there in the browser, and you can also open it up in your local desktop version of VS Code, and it'll be tunneled right into that containerized environment. It's really pretty great, because then you don't have to worry about cloning and setting up your environment and installing from requirements.txt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All those instructions, though, for either one of those are in the repo on the README, so you can check that out. Of course, if some of you are more hardcore, you can build from scratch. Some of you have your own bootstrapped ways of getting started, and that's totally cool. If you're comfortable doing it that way, just get the requirements.txt file, load up your project, and go at it your own way. That's perfectly acceptable. So feel free to do that as well. But I am going to be kind of moving quickly. I will wait until we all feel kind of comfortable getting that set up. Now, if you're using code spaces, what you're going to want to look for is the button over here. There's one that says code, and there's one that says use this template. You can use either one to get the code space started. I like using the template. If you use the code one, it actually gets you the Git history and a couple other things, but using this template just pulls up a very fresh version of the latest version of the repo. You click use this template, open in a code space, and then it takes you to a screen that looks something like this. It takes it about, I don't know, a minute to 2 minutes to build that container. That only happens the first time. If you exit out and you come back to GitHub and go to code spaces, you can just fire it back up. It doesn't have to rebuild the container. So that's only that first time. And again, it takes about 2 minutes or so. So if you're getting all set up, getting that set up, I'm just going to talk really quickly about Fast API. Again, that's the web framework I use. It's a modern, fast web framework. It's in the name there. But mostly for me, the fast is not just merely performance-based. It's also for the developer. It really helps with your development speed when you have type hinting, which is used for validation and for editor support, for autocomplete. It really speeds up your development when using Fast API. That's why I like to use it. It has session, cookie support, all other sorts of features you'd expect from a modern framework. So that's why I use it. Again, if you're coming from any other web framework, whether Django or Flask, hopefully the things we're doing here are not too out of the ordinary. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to come by and answer them. And then I talked a little bit about TinyDB. Again, it's just a document-based database that uses JSON, and it's meant to emulate any ORM or ODM that you're comfortable with. I like to use Beanie with MongoDB. That's kind of the ODM I prefer to use. But it's just kind of there just to get us moving. I've also built this helper class called CRUD to kind of further abstract the database operations you'd ordinarily be doing in a web-based application. So for example, a user makes a request that goes to your server. You're usually making some sort of database call, and then you're doing some sort of logic, and then you're presenting a response back to the user. That's a pretty common workflow operation. So that's what TinyDB is there for. But that's as much of the intro as I can get through. Now I just want to have you go ahead and open up the application and make sure it runs. Now, if you're not used to Fast API, there's the equivalent of run server, or I forget the Flask command. It's going to look something like this. Uvicorn is the server application, and app.main represents the path to the module that has your application, the instance of your application, and it's called app in this case. So if you had called your app something else, you could do it that way. And then the reload flag there is, it's a watcher. So once you start your application, any save to any of your PY files will just restart the server so that you can see the changes in real time. So let's go ahead and get comfortable, open up the application, get it started. When you're done, or when you see it running, if you're in code spaces, what happens is it opens up a port. Sometimes it might give you an error the first time. That's because the order of the build is a little odd. But maybe just go back to the code space and re-click on the I think it's the 127.0 the address, and it'll open up on the port. And you should see the application. It's called Music Binder. So I'll give you a couple minutes. And if you have any questions, go ahead and use your sticky tabs, or you can raise your hands. I can come by in the meantime. Okay.
So do I click this?
No, so go up to the top.
That is mine. Or I go to yours.
And go up to the top. And over here, are you signed in?
Well, okay, let me just...
Yeah, you might need to now you can go here.
And what will it do?
So click and open in code space.
Because when I went to mine, it said new code space, so it wasn't there. But it's a different problem.
Okay. So now it'll build. It'll take about 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. And that's it? Do I need to do the...
Once it loads. Yeah, so once your code space loads, if it's still loading, it'll bring up a new browser window. It looks like an editor. It'll look kind of like VS Code. And it'll have a terminal at the bottom. Usually it brings up the README file first, but you can ignore that or close it. But there will be a terminal window at the bottom. You can type in this command, and then it'll start up the server. There, it'll tell you where to, you can control click, I think, on the address, and it'll bring up a version of the website. I could probably, you know what, I probably should have done this way. So again, this is the button here, and you'd want to open up a code space. If you're signed in, you need to be signed in to see that button. I'll go ahead and kind of go through this as well, just so that you can get a sense. Any other questions? Is anyone still working on setting up their environment? Okay, one back there. So it looks like we're nearly there. Does everyone who's in so far, are you able to see the Music Binder web application? Yeah? Oh, perfect. All right. So as you're starting to poke around in there, and you start seeing the structure of the application, it's kind of meant to emulate a real world application. So I try to kind of follow a structure that you may be familiar with, unless you have a slightly different paradigm of building. I know things are a little bit more opinionated in the Django space, but still, hopefully you're able to kind of get a sense of what's going on. This is what the structure might look like. Most of what we'll be doing on the HTMX front will be in the routes.py file. That's, if you're coming from Flask, that maybe that's a view, or I think in the Django world, those are endpoints. That's kind of where we define the logic of what happens when a user goes to a certain endpoint. And then, of course, all the templates are in this directory here. That's where we'll do a lot of the Tailwind CSS stuff, right? But let's go ahead and focus on the templating. Again, hopefully, most of you have some experience with templates if you're coming from Django or Flask. And if you don't, it may be a lot to get through, so you might miss a few things, but hopefully you get enough here that you can come back and kind of get a sense, or just look through the repo there at how things are being done. Now, the templates directory, the awesome thing about templates is that you can kind of layer them, right? If you're going to have all your meta tags throughout your website, you might just have one base template, right? And then you bring that into all your other templates as you do things. So that's kind of what we've done here. I have a base.html file. The underscore there is just for me, it's helpful, but some of you might not use an underscore. Either way, the main, all the things you would bring in to the rest of your web application are contained in there. So if you take a look, it'll have all the meta tags and defining the style sheets, etc. And then the meat, if you will, would be in these files, about or catalog or main. That's the content that users would see, and you would bring in the content that's in the base, footer, and header files that are up there. That's kind of how it's structured, just so you kind of get a sense of it. The header file, for example, contains all the links that you see up at the top, plus the search bar. So if you ever wanted to just make a change to the links, you would just go to that header file, you would change it up, and then it would change it throughout your website. So that's kind of the idea of templates. You don't have to keep redoing things in different files. You just do it once, and you would see it. You would see it throughout your site. So rendering templates in FastAPI. So again, I mentioned that those endpoints, those views, are defined in the routes.py file. Now, FastAPI does have this class called Jinja2 templates. That's used to define the template location and the context. And that template context is perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind when working with templates. The context contains those Python objects that you want to have access to within your template. So if you're sending over a dictionary or a list or even class objects, you can then use them within your template and display what you need to the user. So it's very, very useful. For, I think actually, I do have a slide on that later. So now, just in case you are already familiar with templates, the main thing you'll see is the template response from the FastAPI, where you'll see this in the routes. Usually I'm sending a response that contains the template file. So the template file there, like template.html in this case, would be relative to the directory that you defined with the Jinja2 templates class. And then the context will always look like this. It must, on the FastAPI side, it must send back the request object, which is what you're getting from the user. I think Flask does this for you. You don't have to specify it. But if you look at the different ways that Django or Flask do the same thing, Django, you do a render, and then you send the request. You define the template file, and then you send the context through. Flask, similarly, you're doing render template. You're defining the file, and then the context is just whatever you send. I don't think you have to define the request, but it's all fairly similar. So hopefully this gets you more or less acquainted with how we're sending things through. If you're noticing things really well, you'll notice there's a library called Jinja2-fragments. This is, I do use this in the application. We'll talk about it a little bit later. Now, there's a class called Jinja2 blocks, and that's a drop-in replacement for Jinja2 templates from FastAPI. What it does is it allows rendering of individual blocks of content within a template file. So again, let me just say that over. Let's say you have a template file that has a lot of content. Jinja2 blocks allows you to send just a portion of that template back to the user. And it's very useful with a particular HTMX interaction that we'll talk about later. It's not super required to use HTMX, but it can become very helpful because you're no longer having to split up little pieces of HTMX code in different, to split things up, but we'll talk about that. All right, that's all gotten us to the point where now we can really get busy with Tailwind CSS. Like, how do we make these templates look better? And that's the question. I don't know how familiar all of you might be with Tailwind CSS, so I just want to talk about it really quickly. Tailwind, I said already, comes with these utility classes. that ensure a consistency in design. So, for example, one of the things I'm thinking about is it comes with a predefined color palette. So say you want a background color that's red. It has different shadings of red from 100, 200, 300, 400, all the way to 900 that has very consistent shading. Then if you're using the same shading of red throughout your design, it'll ensure a very consistent design. Of course, if you're coming from the CSS world, you might be thinking, well, you can use CSS classes and all that stuff where you're predefining those things as well. It's similar to that. What I appreciate about it is that your CSS doesn't keep growing really large. Sometimes when you're working in CSS, you forget that you're no longer using this class, but it's just kind of growing, and then you don't know which part to delete because you're like, wait, am I using that somewhere? And it can get pretty huge. That's if you're doing it from scratch. And it is very safe to just add and remove those utility classes from your HTML, because what happens is you're compiling or you're building the CSS file that you're going to use, so it stays as lean as you're keeping your code. So if you're only using specific classes for spacing and color design, it's only going to compile those into the CSS file. And if you're changing things completely, it'll compile again. You don't have to worry about tooling around in your CSS file. And it's super great for this template/component-based design. It complements the way that we're building with HTMX. That's a great reason to use Tailwind. Now, one of the questions that comes up with Tailwind, though, is let's say you're looking at the links yeah, go ahead and look at the links that are in the templates folder that are in the header HTML file. What you'll notice is there's 3 links, and those links all have like a very long HTML element. So people often wonder about code duplication. You see, it's repeated, and we come from a programming world where we don't want to repeat ourselves, right? Now, for these components such as buttons or cards, one thing you'll notice is that structure is just as important as the CSS a lot of times. And even though, let's say you've created custom classes for these very specific looking links, what may happen is, let's say you don't want links anymore, but you want to keep the design, or you want to change them to a different kind of element, you would have to redo the CSS as well as the front end piece as well. And these complex changes, like let's say you wanted to change text to a link, well, now you're having to change the A element for, in your CSS. It can become really cumbersome. Instead, you can make all those changes within the HTML, within the respective component. And there's this piece in the CSS documentation that talks about this. It says components and template partials solve this problem much better than CSS-only abstractions, because a component can encapsulate the HTML and the style. So you're, again, because you're within your HTML, you can make all your changes in one place. And that's there in the documentation. I will have some notes with a lot of this info afterwards, so if you're missing some of these links, they will be available. So you're wondering, how do I use Tailwind with Python? So there's this wonderful library called PyTailwind CSS. Ordinarily, Tailwind CSS requires NPM, and the whole point is we're trying to not use JavaScript, right? And NPM is its own it brings about its own complexity, right? Now, Tailwind CSS, the team behind it, has also built a standalone CLI tool that you can build yourself, and you can pull that down locally and then use commands within your terminal. But what PyTailwind CSS does is it wraps that CLI into something that's on the PyPI website. So you can pip install PyTailwind CSS. Now you have a wrapper around this Tailwind CLI, and you can use those commands in your terminal just as well as any other Python-based CLI. So it's pretty awesome. You use the command Tailwind CSS init once, which you don't have to do right now if you've opened up the code space. But what that basically does is it builds the pieces that you need for Tailwind to work, such as the config file, the tailwind config.js file. Now, there's 3 important concepts with Tailwind CSS that I want to talk about. Those are the 3 here. So the tailwind config.js file, the directives, I'll talk about that in a second, and the build process. Those are, I think, the most important pieces. The first one, the tailwind.config.js file, that's what happens when you run that command. It creates this file in your project root. You might see it there in the music binder application. This defines where the Tailwind CSS will look for the content. So it looks for those utility classes within a certain directory. In our case, it's in the app, in the templates directory there, and its recursive is looking for anything that ends with HTML. So it looks through those files that are in that directory at build time, and it compiles a CSS file that then you will be using. So that's what the tailwind.config.js file is for primarily, but there are other things you see there like theme and extend. Those are some advanced use cases, which I'll talk about later. But that's important, must-have for Tailwind to work. But the cool thing is you run that command, it builds it for you. The only thing you really have to fill in is the content if you want to. You could just star everything and it would look through your entire project, but usually you want to point it in the right direction. The next thing is this thing called the Tailwind directives. This is a input file that Tailwind uses. The base, the components, the utilities. This is a directive for Tailwind to know what to build into the output, into the main.css, or however you call your CSS file. It has to be there. There's some other cool things that you can do with this file, which we'll also talk about later. You can build it once, forget about it, and use Tailwind at will. You don't have to worry about what's going on here. But over here, you can also define your own custom styles. You can also define the fonts you want to use, if you want to use special fonts, etc. We can see some of that later. And then the third piece that's the most important is probably just the build process. So again, because you're writing these classes into your HTML, Tailwind needs to know about it at some point. So after you've worked in your HTML, created your styles how you want them, this build process then basically says, look at the input file, which is going to be that directives file we just saw. That's what I call input CSS here. And send it to this output.css, which is the one that you're actually going to use in your HTML. And there's also a flag. So this is what it looks like in the Music Binder app. If you were to run it there, you'll notice that the tailwind-i, which is input, is pointed to this tw.css file. That's just what I called it. You can call it whatever you want. A lot of people call it input.css. And I output it to a file called main.css, and that's the one I'll call within my HTML. And you'll also see the watch flag. I love the watch flag. It recompiles every time you save. Every time you save a new anything in your in that content directory that we saw. So you make any change, recompiles. It takes like microseconds to compile, so it's not slowing you down at all. So what I like to do usually is have 2 terminal windows open. I have one that's running the application I'm working on, the server. I'm watching for changes on that, my fast API. Then I have another window with this watching for CSS changes, and it's all happening real time. So I'm changing things up, reloading my browser, and it's instant. So it's great for prototyping and building quickly. And additionally, I did include the this command as a startup on app startup. So in case you forget to compile, it'll at least compile every time you start your application. Because sometimes you can build stuff and forget to run this command, and then you see things aren't changing, and you're wondering, wait, didn't I just type that in? That happens to me still, even though I've been working with this stuff a lot. All right, so what does Tailwind look like in your HTML? So it looks a little bit like this. And at first, again, it'll start looking a little busy. So you're defining a class, and each one of these classes is creating again, on build time, it's creating the equivalent in CSS. So over here, this div element is going to have a background color of slate 50, which is a lighter color. And I'm also setting the max width of this screen to large. Again, it's a utility class, so the large is already predefined. I forget exactly the pixels at this point. And then the H1 class, so the header, I'm going to create a text that's 3XL. Now again, as a utility class, all these things are predefined. One thing I forgot to mention is if you were to not include any of these classes in your HTML, you're getting a full CSS reset. So everything looks very basic without any classes applied. So you're having to explicitly state, I want my headers to be big. If I didn't have that text 3XL there, then it would just be very like regular text size, right? I want the font to be bold. I want it to be uppercase. So these end up on compile time, they end up looking a little bit like this in your CSS. So on compile time, the main.css file will have a text 3XL class that has the font size predefined and the line height predefined. Here's that BG slate that we saw. It looks like max width screen for large is 1024 pixels. Of course, font bold is 700, and uppercase, we're doing a text transform. So that's all on build time. So if you're thinking about it, you're just typing in your HTML, hitting save, and this builds automatically for you. If you change anything, it'll rebuild it. Like if you want to go to 4XL, this will disappear from your main, and another class called 4XL will appear just instantly, and you're not having to go in there and make adjustments in that case. Okay, so now I want you to go ahead and play around with it. So let's go ahead and let's see. I want you to go ahead and try to create. Let's see. Let's redesign the links. So there's links in the header template, right? You can see how they function right now. There's a hover effect that puts a little bottom border, I believe, in the current version of that application. I want you to change those to function more like buttons, like maybe create a background color for them, and maybe do another hover effect. So you might be thinking, well, I don't know these utility classes. How am I supposed to know to do that? So I'll give you two resources that I use a lot. The first is just the tailwindcss.com/docs. They have a search window there on the left, and if you're wanting to know how to change a font, you type in font, and it gives you all the list of the utility classes. It's a very, very, very useful website. I always have it open just to kind of get a sense of what's available to me. You can even type in color, for example, or BG, and it'll show you all the different utility colors that you have with the actual examples there. Let me actually show you what that looks like, because I get pretty excited about Tailwind CSS, just their documentation. Let's say I wanted to learn how to do background color. So I just type in background. You'll notice that it already starts putting some things here. I don't think background was what I was looking for. And here you're typing in usually the equivalent of the CSS properties. So maybe I'll go to color. There's text decoration color, text color. All right, what is text color? Here it tells you how you can set the text color. And notice that it starts with slate. Slate is a predefined color, and here are the colors on the right side. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. If I keep going down, here's what gray looks like, neutral, stone. Here's what the red ones look like. So if I were to type in text red 200, this would be the equivalent here. But darker is 900. Here's the equivalent here. And so on. So you can get a sense of how to set things. Let's say you wanted to work with padding. I want to know how to set the padding. You click here, and you can already see P-0 is 0 pixels. PX-0 is padding left and padding right. So you think x-axis. PY is y-axis, so 0 and 0. And then you start adding numbers. So PX-1 would be, it's not 1 pixel, it's just different equivalents. And then it kind of shows you what those are. So PX1, for example, would be 0.25 REM, so the equivalent of 4 pixels. So you can start styling those buttons to look exactly how you want, whether you want larger buttons, smaller buttons. Try to change those around. But for you to be able to see what you're doing, remember, you want to be able to have this, you want to have that compilation watching for any saves that you make to the templates. Because otherwise you're not going to see the changes in your application. So open up a second terminal window. One has your app running. One has your Tailwind watcher running. And then start playing around with the CSS. So I'll see if my, this is what my code space looks like. So I would close this out. The first thing I would probably do is open up a separate terminal. So you can do that here if you're not familiar with this. And then that puts 2 terminals side by side here. I don't know if you can see that. Let me make this a little bigger. And the first one, I would do the unicorn with the reload flag. I will make them available, yes. They're not right now. This isn't a slide. I'm just doing this live right now, this screen share. So so again, this command here starts up the application right here on 127.0.0.1, port 8000. And you'll notice when I did this the first time, it'll give you this log message here that it actually, because there's a new code space, it does actually have to download that wrapped Tailwind, and it installs it directly from Tailwind Labs. And now you see, because I have the rebuild command set on app startup, you see that it rebuilt in 396 milliseconds, and then the startup is complete. So now I should be able to open here. If you press Control-C and click, it should open a version of the application. The first time is it needs to forward to the port. So here's the application, and these are the buttons we're going to change. Let me make that a little bigger. Yeah, so you'll notice there's a random, it randomizes the picture that comes up first. So yeah, it might be slow based on the, okay. So I want us to change these up. So if you're back in here, in that second terminal, that's where I would run this command. And again, it's a little wordy. Tailwind CSS. Ooh, it's going slow. If you have VS Code locally, you might be able to open this up locally. It might be a little snappier. And you have to give it the, actually I don't know if you need the app.static source tw.css. Actually, I might need to wrap that in, I think I need to wrap that in, I don't remember if I need to wrap that in quotes or not. Maybe. I'll just do it this time. Then the output is going to be similar. No, not source. It's going to be CSS main. Now, most times when you have something like this, again, I like to memorize commands and stuff, but this stuff you could probably automate with either a make file or however your build process is, whatever makes sense to you. I also like to have the compilation on app startup. Additionally, you can even have a watcher on the template files from within Fast API as well, so that it reloads for changes in the template as well. There's a lot of different things you can do. But once you click that, it should do an initial rebuild. Now, when you go to your templates, so you'll know it worked if it rebuilt once. Now, if you go to your templates and you were to go to your header, and you can see the links here. I mean, maybe. So right now I have these. Oh, I forgot to mention. If you use VS Code and if you use PyCharms, I believe, they both have really awesome Tailwind CSS extensions. For VS Code, you do have to download it. Because if you've used the code space, it's already pre-installed for you. If you're local, you do have to download the extension for Tailwind. But it is the second piece that I would say. If you use the documentation in another window, you can also use the extension for VS Code, and it is extremely awesome, and I'll show you why. So over here, when I mouse over any of these classes, the extension allows me to see what the matching or corresponding CSS is for any one of these classes. In addition, if I'm wanting to change a specific aspect, so let's say I want to change the background of this button, and I start typing BG, let's say red, and I hit Control Space. Well, it's a little slow. I think it's because of the Wi-Fi situation. What it does is it gives you a, yeah, it's super slow. But even if I were just to type BG red 500 and I hit save, you'll notice the compilation happening in the bottom for each save. And if I go here, I feel like everything's going a little. You're saying this part here?
Yeah, so it says done.
Mm-hmm.
For me too, but I don't see the code.
So, oh, I see. So go ahead and open up the template directory. So go to app.
Over here.
Right here under app, yeah. And find the templates directory. So that's going to be right here. Yep. And go to shared. So there's one called header. And so this is going to be your HTML. So you can make changes directly in any of the elements to see the changes.
I know how to make them.
You can kind of follow just the same pattern. So you'll see, for example, that there's a px3 that's padding, and any time that you mouse over, it'll show you the corresponding CSS. So that's what that represents. Has anyone been able to change their buttons up to see, change them up in any which way? Or any questions? I am not. Oh, yours isn't changing? Let me take a look.
So I was in header, like editors for,
Mm-hmm.
and then I kind of
Just trying it out.
saved it.
Okay, and I do see that it's recompiling. That's interesting.
I'm up here, refresh.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, mine's doing it. I wonder if is it connected to the same website? Or is it, I mean, like be connected to like a different instance of that?
Yeah, let me see.
Maybe if you just relaunch your app or something. Just
That might be it, because I'm seeing down here,
to make sure it's the same instance.
that might be, well,
You can just kill it and relaunch it.
probably. So let's try that. Oh, command, sorry.
Open browser up, right?
Oh yeah, that works too, yeah.
Yeah. Button there.
Well, what I was trying to see is if you
Oh.
hit command, it's usually if you hit command and,
Yeah, I think
oh, there it
that's
goes.
what it is.
All right, so it's not seeing this. Let's go back. Which one is it?
This one.
This one? Okay, okay. That should be the home button. That is interesting. It is using main. I wonder. Okay, let me check. So it's compiling to main, so we should be able to see if it actually built it.
changes.
Yeah. Can you search for BG Red? I guess it was. So it is
Yep,
here.
it's
That's
here, yeah.
bizarre. Oh, you know what? I think with Macs, it's a caching thing. So it
Clear
caches.
the cache and-
Yeah, you might need to clear cache.
Let me try that. I don't want to keep you here for
Yeah,
so long.
it's all good. Yes.
The question.
Yes.
So, if I were to change the background for example, the header, it does not. It's being like so-called overridden by the actual background of this component.
Oh.
Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, like, how do you mitigate this? Like, for example, I want to change it to red or orange.
You wanted to change the background color?
Yes, but
So,
of course the component
yeah,
behind
so part of what I do is I would
inspect
inspect it and see which component it is. So you'll see where it's defined. So this one, so it has the BG slate here. So find that and change this to like BG slate or BG orange or something, and see it changed automatically.
So my question is,
Mm.
right, because we want to reduce like having our code everywhere. So
Mhm.
how do we manage it in the case where, for example, I set the background as orange, there's no point putting this CSS tailwind here, right? Because it does not ultimately affect the code.
So you were looking at, you were trying to change it here, right?
So this effectively has no effect on the component.
Go back to that inspect element and look for header. See, it's here.
Yeah.
So the thing is,
This is overriding.
yeah, it's overriding it. So you would need to change it here and then just remove it from the header class. Or, I mean, again, it'll just be based on your own design element. So if you're thinking about layering it and you're doing a full background,
Yeah.
it's just kind of think, all right, so I'm going to change this, and then I'm going to put this on top of it and only change that. So it might just be a design choice.
I think like through experience of working in Tailwind CSS, this is one of the problems that
Mhm.
I have, where it's like finding that exact element that has to change.
That has changed. I see what you're
So
saying.
wondering how do you mitigate this when you have like multiple nested components?
That's a good question. I'll address that up front.
Thank you so
Mhm.
much.
All right, any other questions?
Could you show please one example?
Yeah, I will.
How to do this things?
Mm-hmm. So you'll see, again, for some Mac users, I don't know if that solved the problem up here. Sometimes when you're working with CSS, there's a whole thing with caching. So if you make a change, even if you recompile and it builds a new main.css and you refresh your website, it's still showing the old thing. It might be an issue with caching. I have seen that before where you, I like to use the Vivaldi browser because it kind of is very privacy friendly and also resets the cache each time you reload. So that's something to think about. So I did want to show real quick, notice how I put in this class here, bgred 500, and now when I refreshed my website here, you'll notice that the button is red, right? That's the only thing that's changed so far. I don't like square buttons. They look ugly to me. So I would go back to that class. Sorry. And I would add something called rounded. Actually, rounded maybe large. And save. Was that wrong? Maybe it's not rounded. It's just taking a while. Like my saves are taking a while. They're rebuilt. Once I see it says done with the rebuild, that's when I can go back and check. See how now it's a little more round? I don't know if you can tell. So very quickly I can start experimenting with different, with different design elements. I don't really like this, is too dark. Now, if I wanted to stay red, but I just wanted to be a shade lighter, instead of 500, maybe I'll use 300. Again, the save is slow, but see how the extension tells me what bgred looks like. So that's helpful, right? And then if I go back and refresh, well, it's taking it a minute. One thing with these demos is you never expect the slow internet. Yeah, it's like it's not even responding right now. But that kind of gets you in a good spot. Now, let's say you wanted to make changes to all of your oops. So the red square appears from the extension with VS Code that allows you to see a preview of the colors. So these colors are part of the VS Code extension. They kind of get a quick sense. So for repeatability, one of the things I recommend is using multi-cursor editing. Now, I'm a complete newbie. When I first started trying multi-cursor stuff, it just seemed really crazy to me. But when you're working with Tailwind, it's so useful that I learned it really quick. With VS Code, for example, if you use Alt and you click, you now have a cursor in all three places. So I could do something like BG red 300. So that's one way to do editing for these lines. Let's say you have elements all around your HTML and you just wanted to select certain ones. Another thing that you can do is highlight a certain piece of the code and press, I think it's Control-Shift-L, and now you have a cursor on all matching aspects. These are just tricks with your editor. Multi-cursor editing, you know, people who are kind of old school have used Vim and that kind of stuff might be very familiar with it. For me, it was kind of new. I learned it mostly because I liked editing my elements quickly. And once you learn that, oh man, it's great, because now I can do this and save. It recompiles. You see, it took 28 milliseconds to recompile just that one aspect. Again, if the internet's not busted here. See, there they are, right? And that was just one change and a save, and I can come and see the immediate effect. So if you were working in CSS and you were thinking, oh, let me style a button, you would go into your CSS file, you would create the the properties for that CSS element, for a button element. You would go back to your HTML, you would put that class in each element of your HTML, then you would refresh and you would see this. So it reduces a lot of that back and forth. You're never really having to go to your CSS file at all. So that's kind of how that looks. Now, if you wanted some extra credit, let's see. You could create a new detail endpoint. This is only for some of you. If you want to if you feel comfortable with what you're doing, you could create a new detail endpoint. So you would go to the routes.py file and make it showcase any artist image and profile. To do that, you would use a TinyDB CRUD function, maybe the getRandomArtist one, and then make it take up the whole page. I'm going to go over one more item based on a question I received back here, and then we're going to take a quick break. Not so quick. Let's take about a 15-minute break, 10-minute break. But first, before that, one of the questions that comes up is when you're working in, let me go back to that page. Let's say you wanted to make specific changes, like I want to change this background color here, or I want to change the header. What are some ways that you could make changes quickly? Like I need to see how this would look green or black or whatever, but you're not quite sure which element it's in. You might go into the header file and change the background color there, and you don't see an effect. What's the best way to kind of get a sense of where you are in the cascading style sheet? So for example, I have these dark blue, or I don't know if this is the slate color here in the background, but where is this truly coming from? And I think that's pretty valid. For me, it's easier when I'm working with my own code base and I've built it from the ground up, so I kind of know exactly where to look. But a lot of times we're sharing code, or you're starting to collaborate on a project. You might only be in charge of a certain component, and you're not as familiar with what else is going on. I love using inspect element first and foremost, even when working with Tailwind, because that gets me the closest. And I don't know if I can make this. How can I make this bigger? Like when I start looking at what's happening in each of these cases, I start seeing the class names that I recognize from Tailwind, and it starts giving me a sense of where they are on the page. So if I mouse over the body class, for example, and I see Slate 900, all right, well, this is a background color. So I get a sense that it's something that's affecting this entire page. what I've done is I've cascaded everything on top of this slate, and that's what this color is here. So if I were to find this class and change it in the HTML, that's actually on the base class here. I could go to this slate here and say, I prefer to have orange maybe. I hit save. It recompiles in 22 ms. And let's see how it changed just by making that one change. So you can see pretty drastic changes very easily without having to dig through. All right, let me find the element, see what class is referenced. Let me go to the CSS, find that class. Let me change that property and go back and refresh and see if it's been added. And when you're making numerous changes, again, once you're in your HTML, you're set. you don't have to keep. And what I appreciate as well is because of the compile build time, you're getting rid of stuff you're not using, and you're only keeping things you're using. And I find that very valuable. So yeah, inspect element, the documentation website is really helpful. The plugins for your editor are also extremely helpful. And that's pretty much all you need from the Tailwind's perspective. Once you get a sense of how the classes are named and what they do, you're rarely even looking at the documentation, especially if you have those plugins. You're kind of just testing them, hitting save, checking the effect, and just changing things on the go, adding padding. Like you can think of how you can affect the padding element pretty easily. Like let's say you think these buttons are too close, you don't like them, so you go back to the header file and you think, well, the px, which is the x-axis, is set to 0.75 rem, and I see that because I'm doing a mouse over on this class. Then I just oops, I missed that one. I might want like 6. I hit save. It's taking a moment again. There, it's rebuilt. I go back, I refresh. That actually, the padding element makes them wider. That's right. It wasn't the margins. So if I wanted the margins to be wider, again, I just go back. Instead of MX2, we're thinking 6 as well. See, now they're wider apart. And you can play around with it that way just to kind of get a sense. And again, this is helpful with the template component-based design. Another thing with Tailwind is instead of thinking so much as for individual classes, there's these pre-made components, some of them on the Tailwind site, other free component sites. They just give you a button component which has all those pre-built classes. You just paste it right in and you have a nice looking button. You don't have to do much else. That's another really cool thing. So it is 10:08. Let's take a 12-minute break, come back at 10:20. And if you have any questions, I'm up here. And again, I'll leave this up on the screen in case you wanted to challenge yourself. And I'll put on some music. All right, see you back in 12. All right. All right, hopefully you got a chance to stretch your legs, get something to drink, take some deep breaths. We're going to get to the super fun part next, which is HTMX. I know some of us are still kind of testing out Tailwind CSS. It's one of those things that you'll get the most out of it when you play around with it. So when you have a spare moment, you have access to this repo, take it with you, just start playing around with the classes and changing them up, seeing what's going on. Now I know some folks have been having issues with making the change, seeing the rebuild command, refreshing their browser, and they don't see the change. Most of the time, that's going to be caching. what you can do is you can look at the main.css file that's in the static directory just to make sure that it's building, that the class you built is being defined in there. And then you can view source on the front end, and if you see that class referenced in the HTML, it means the pieces are there. It just means maybe for some reason the caching is looking at the old version of the CSS file. That's possible. But again, come and find me. I am thinking of maybe hosting an open space to talk more about some of this Tailwind stuff and HTMX stuff that maybe we can't get in the tutorial. So if you want to do that, look for it maybe later during the conference. Okay, moving on, HTMX. So I talked about a simple site, and this kind of started as a simple site. I was just kind of building something from scratch, a basic hello world. I wanted to see how far I could get with just Tailwind, just HTMX. Now, HTMX, what it will do is it will reduce that complexity. Again, I'm a non-developer that tries to do it at night, so I don't want to have to learn JavaScript to do web stuff. It's too much mental overhead for me. If you want, but I want to have that kind of modern UI, that feel of something that's quite responsive. And if I can do that all directly from HTML, so much the better. Now, HTMX, I don't know how much you know about it. If you're here, you may have heard about it, or you may have seen. One of my favorite things about HTMX is the Twitter account where they have lots of memes. I could give you some really well-reasoned, detailed, and insightful things. And mind you, all of that is there at the htmx.org site. There's some really great essays as to why this is a good design pattern. But memes are so much more fun, right? Now, again, like coming from a lack of experience maybe on my end with JavaScript, I don't know what client-side routing is. I don't want to know what client-side routing is. To me, it makes sense the way we've presented it so far. A user makes a request from the front end. You receive this on the server side. You do what you need to do, get the information you need to send back, and you send it back to the user. It just makes sense to me. I don't see why there would need to be so much more complexity, right? So speaking of complexity, how do you install HTMX? You basically copy a file into your project, and that's it. So HTMX itself is vanilla JavaScript that someone else wrote that you never have to look at. I put it in a folder in my static directory. I think I called it probably JS, under JS directory. And that's it. That's really it. Now you can reference that script within your HTML. And since we're using templates, what I did is I included the script source in that base template. You see it here under this line particularly. You would just do a script source that points directly to your HTMX file. I called this one htmx.min.js. You can find that in the base.html template, and that's all you need to get working with HTMX. That's it. I just find that quite a bit easier than, I think at some point I installed NPM on my machine. I don't know what I was doing. As a matter of fact, these slides are revealed.js, so just kidding, I did have a little bit of JavaScript in this presentation. But that's about as far as I'll get. I'll build my slides with it. What does HTMX look like? This is directly from the htmx.org site. This is what it looks like in your HTML. Here we have a button element, which you may be familiar with, but then we have a lot of these HX attributes. The first one says, and sorry if it's the contrast is a little odd, HX-post is for the endpoint clicked, HX trigger is click, HX target is the parent div, HX swap is outer HTML, and then the button says click me. So what do all these things do? The first thing that we do is we're sending a post request to the clicked route. So anytime a user clicks on this button, it is already sending a post request. It doesn't matter that it's not in a form or that it's a submit button or anything like that. This could be a div element or a p element or a span element. It could be whatever you want it to be. This is sending that post request to the clicked route, so we can understand that within our Fast API application. The second thing is it is triggered by a click. So that HX trigger says that when you click this button, it's going to send a post request. So there's other kinds of actions that you could use. Next, the target for the response is an HTML element with an ID of parent div. So when you click this button, it's pointing to this other element that has that ID. It can be wherever you want in your HTML. And the HX swap point here, what that means is your response can either be sent within that element. So let's say your div element, your parent div element, you only want to swap what's inside of it, then you could do it that way. Or you could replace the whole element, which means the outer HTML that represents the outer element. So you will no longer have that parent div anymore if you use this particular command. So it does all of those things by just defining that. Whatever response you send back will go into that element in the DOM, and that's it. That's HTMX. So it's a pretty great example. Again, that's on the htmx.org site. And how do we know what to do on the server side? Like, how do we know when we get this request at the clicked endpoint? Well, how do we know what to do with it? So HTMX sends particular data through request headers. Again, if some of you aren't as familiar with some of this terminology, you can always come back to the recording of the tutorial as you get a better idea. But most of you, if you've worked in the web, you get a sense of what the request headers are and how to access them. With Fast API, it's sent as I think a dictionary item, and then you can look for specific requests headers. Some of the ones that you're going to look at that are sent from HTMX, these are just some. There are many others, but these I'd say are some of the most important ones. So there will be an HX request that is always true when the request is generated from an HTMX attribute. So in this sense, because HX request is always true in our Python application, we can look for that header. If HX request, then we just want to send this response, right? But if someone navigates to that endpoint, you might not want to send just a partial response. You might want to refresh the whole page. That's why that HX request is so important. Other things that you can send through are the target, the trigger, and what current URL is sending this information. That's all useful, and we'll see how a little later. But these are just some examples. More information of that, again, is on the htmx.org website. What do we do in our code? It might be something like this. In Fast API, you use a app.get or router.get, and you put the endpoint. So if it were the previous one, this might be, instead of page, it might say clicked or whatever. You define a function, or a view in this case, that is doing two things. First, it's setting the template to some page.html. That presumes that someone is navigating to the page endpoint. This template, this some page HTML, might be a full representation of what someone should see. It'll include the base element and the content. But let's say someone actually clicked something that is an HX request. Then what we're doing is we're using if the request has an HX request element in there, then the template is actually only this partial content that's going to replace that element in the DOM. So you might only be replacing like a small piece of information. So you don't want to send your entire template to go into that small piece. That happens to me a lot when I'm testing things out. I end up with a version of the entire site in one little window. I'm like, oh, I must have not checked if this was an HX request. So that's where the HX request comes really handy. And again, if you were to go through this again, we're setting the template to some page.html. We're checking if that request was triggered by HTMX. If it was, then we're changing that template object to the partial content.html. So then when we send that template response back to the user, either way it's going to be the correct based on the way it was requested. And of course, the context might vary based on how it's requested, but this is just a more simplified version of what's happening. The somepage.html, again, if you were creating an entire element, might look something like this. It's extending the base template. You're saying whatever you're saying in the body. You might have a random image there, etc. And then if you wanted to just refresh that image, maybe that button click was just needed to refresh this div element that's called random image, then a regular request would require a full page reload, but an HX request would then only replace that element. But in order to replace that element, you would need that partial content to be in a separate file, usually, unless you're using that Jinja 2 blocks, which we'll talk about later. But then your partial content HTML might be something as small as this. It has only the specific element that would be changing, because the HX request wanted you to replace that one element in your web page, and you don't have to do a full page refresh. And that's pretty great. You can see how great that would be in a pretty large website if you're only needing to change one thing. Instead of doing a full page refresh, you're only refreshing a small element of the DOM. That's pretty fantastic without anything other than what we've seen. The fragments that we talked about later, this is using the Jinja 2 blocks, allows you to do things slightly differently. So instead of having two files, which one would be the one that we saw before, the somepage.html, in this case, you would only have one page called somepage.html. But now, the template response allows for an additional parameter called block name. This means that within that template response, or I'm sorry, within that somepage.html, if the request comes from HTMX, if this block name will be some name, whatever it is, now what the template response is looking for is a specific block name using the same terminology that Jinja uses for blocks, and it will only render that item. So you're using the same template file. You no longer need two files. The block name is only triggered if it's an HTMX request, and it'll match some name block in your template, right? So your template will look like this. So now it looks almost identical to what we saw before, except that the random image is, it has a block name that starts right before the div element and ends right after it. So now when it renders, it's only rendering that part of the template. So it seems a little odd now, but once you start inserting some dynamic attributes to, say, the image, if it was a dynamic image, now you can see how much more useful it would be to have it all in one file. Locality behavior, you have it there. You don't need to go hunting for different files. Both of those methods work. We'll see why this method might be more useful when you're working with kind of a bigger application. So a regular request renders everything. We already knew that. It'll include that content from the base HTML. An HTMX request would then only render that partial content that is within that block name. So if you've been kind of paying attention and you start imagining the types of things that you can do with HTMX, you pretty much have accomplished a lot already. You're a full stack developer now, right? Again, these memes are from HTMX website. Like, if you follow their Twitter, it's pretty great stuff. Most of the things that you're gonna want to do in UX design is covered with HTMX. If there are additional things, there are some caveats, some things that you might introduce a little bit of JavaScript. It's okay to do that too. It's not an either-or proposition. That's one thing to really think about. If you have already experience with JavaScript and it's useful in certain ways, that's great. But the emphasis here is to try to reduce as much complexity as you can first, and then add on top of that anything that might be missing. Okay, so that's gotten us to a pretty good spot at understanding HTMX. I wanted to show a couple things on the repository. Let me go here. You know what, before I get into that, I just wanted to, someone asked what's going on with this website to begin with. So this started as a simple site. I didn't even really have an idea as much as to what I was going to be building. Then I started thinking about something I like, which is music. I like music, and I wanted to kind of deal with a topic that is fun for me. So I went to this API, the Discogs API. I don't know if many of you have heard of it. It's mostly for music collectors. I don't necessarily collect records or anything like that, but it has a pretty good API. So I went to that API and I downloaded a lot of data from some of my favorite artists just to kind of take a look at it. And I put all that data, again with TinyDB, into a JSON file. And then I started thinking about the olden days when I used to have these CD binders where I would like flip through them, and I just love looking at the like liner notes or pictures of my favorite bands, and it was really cool. The CDs probably didn't work because they were all scratched up, but I just loved looking through all the binders. So I thought, you know, why don't I emulate that sort of experience and kind of take a look at what some of these artists look like. So I built this site which uses, again, the Discogs API to connect to these images, which are actually linking to their website. So none of this is local. You'll notice it's not even in the static assets. Most of the time, if you're building a site, you would have your images either locally or in a CDN or something. But these are actually all contained elsewhere. So anytime I click randomize, it's actually looking at, it's actually pulling the image from a URL that's pointing to the Discogs API, right? And when you're dealing with API data, sometimes you have incomplete data or you're not quite sure what's there. So it's something to think about in your design, especially if you're building off of someone else's data. So I thought it was also an interesting problem. Can I showcase something that kind of works? So you'll notice some oddities when you go to the catalog here, which you'll notice like some names have a like a parentheses 4, parentheses 3. That's because, again, this is taken directly from the Discogs API. So it's a user-sourced database, data storage. So, you know, people are making sometimes duplicate entries for artists or bands, and I didn't clean the data myself. I just was using directly what they had. So you'll notice that over here, you're seeing like some weird things. That's why it's like that. But these are my, you know, some of my favorite bands that I've listened throughout the years, among others. But I just took a sampling. I like to joke in my Mastodon account. I was joking about how this might be the first tutorial that comes with a playlist. So I will link you to the playlist that has one song from each of these bands, and it's part of what you were hearing earlier when you came in. So that music is there for you to listen to as well. So that's what this site is for, just to get an idea. The homepage is just meant to have a random image from one of the bands that's on here. The About page doesn't do much. It just kind of tells you a little bit of that history. And the catalog page, this is showcasing some cool things with HTMX. So I'll show you that now. Let's say you have a database that has all this info, and you wanted it to populate these cards. Now, you could code that all in yourself, right? But with a template, all you have to do is load a, you know, whether it's a class element or just a list of elements, and then you can build a for loop within your template, and all you're ever building is one card. And then it just cycles through your list, and it starts populating just using a flexbox or whatever, whether you're using grid or flexbox, you could do it either way. And now, let's say I wanted the user to have a little bit more information about each one of these bands. So I wanted to populate whatever profile is listed on each one of these artists when you click on any one of these elements. So you'll notice if I click here, it brings up the profile that's linked to that particular database entry. When I clicked here, you did not see a full page refresh. All you saw was that this particular element populated the profile. If I go to the next one and click, it'll do the same thing. And I can go to any one of these and do the same thing. And that's all HTMX, and it's a fairly straightforward HTMX call, similar to what we've seen, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight was the search. Now, search is interesting in a lot of different ways. When you're doing a search to your database, it's usually someone will type things in and hit enter, and then it'll do that search. But how cool would it be if you could send a request on key press, right? So what you'll notice, first of all, is when I click here, it changes to search results here. And notice that if I type you'll start seeing that the responses change. And if I just wanted the album leaf, notice that it is refreshing as I type. So on each key press, well, let me rephrase that. On each key up, it is doing a post request. That post request is then making a search in my database, sending that response back, and filling up this area here. One question you may have, though, isn't that dangerous with like key presses? Like someone's just mashing on their keyboard, wouldn't that just send a million requests to your server and just basically bombard you? Yes, that could happen. So for this particular active search, what I do is I put in a delay of 500 milliseconds before a request is sent. So if someone is mashing their keyboard, it's not going to send a request until they stop for 500 milliseconds. So to see this in action, what you can see is if you're in the terminal, you'll notice the requests show up here because I have a print statement on the terminal. Notice right here there's a print statement, and I don't know if maybe I can do it this way. All right, so look here on the left as I type. If I were to just do, let me see. Notice that there's nothing happening because I'm just smashing my keyboards, right? Nothing's happening. But as soon as I let go, I don't like that one. If I just do that, notice that there is a request that was made down here. And if I went to type something else in, it caught 2 requests because I paused between the E and the S. So that's all HTMX as well. You're seeing a very dynamic experience between the user and the information. They're typing, they're seeing things change. It's not doing a full page refresh each time. It's only refreshing the search results area, right? And you can still do this check once you've searched to see it change. So how is that happening? I wanted to show you a little bit of at least the route for changing the profile, just so you get a sense of how that happens. Most of that, like I mentioned, is going to be in the routes.py file. So I'm going to go here to routes.py. I'm going to hide this for now. I'm going to go down to the one that's called catalog. I tried to put enough information in the documentation there so you get a sense of what's happening. I'll try to explain as best I can, and it should follow with some of the things we've already seen. And then I have these little to-do items here, which are some things we can work on through the remainder of the tutorial. We'll have about an hour and a half to work on some of these. I want to give you a challenge. In addition to some of the things here, there's some issues in the repo that we can work on. I'll probably work on some up here as well, so you can kind of get a sense of how those are being built. But I really wanted us to have a lot of hands-on time with HTMX and make sure I can answer all your questions as best I can. But you'll notice how this one's happening. So this catalog endpoint is what we see previously here, right? The catalog endpoint. When we go to the catalog endpoint, we want to make sure that we refresh this entire page. So that's the first thing that we need to worry about, which is getting all the items from the database and making sure that they display. So the first thing I do is I instantiate a database object here. So I'm using this utility class that I built. You don't really need to know much about that. Again, if you're used to using your own database, ordinarily this just gives you access to a couple methods that we can use for this application. So I instantiate that, and then the way that I get all my artists or all the elements within that database is I just built this all items method. So that gives us a list of dictionary items. So now we have a ton of, it's 60, I think it's 63 artists. So a list of 63 dictionaries. We give the template a name, catalog.html, so that's going to be there in your templates folder under catalog.html. And then we start defining this context. Again, this is the most important part of sending the data back to the user through the template. We're going to have the request, which always needs to go, so this always needs to be included. Then we have this list of artists that goes into, that uses this this name within the template to access this list of artists. You'll also notice an interesting thing here. This is something that I took for granted a lot when learning about templates, which is because functions or methods are objects, you can actually send those to your templates and utilize them within your templates. So I built these helper functions that I send directly to the template. And what these functions do is they take one artist element, so one dictionary element, and it gets the information that I need from that artist dictionary. So the get website parses through that dictionary and outputs the URL that I need. And the reason I did that is because there's some logic. Some of the artists might be missing a URL, for example. So I have to make sure that I check for that or make a generic website or something. Same thing with active members. The API actually has active and inactive members. So I didn't want to send all of those through blankly. So I'm actually just sending this function through to the template, and then for each artist that I am iterating over, I feed that to this object to get the members that I need to display on that card. And same thing with get profile. Some of the artists did not have a profile listed, so I need to make sure I checked for that as well. So I'm sending these methods directly to the template. Here, we saw this earlier. So this is populating regularly. But what happens when I have an HX request? Well, I don't want to populate that entire thing into this one little card. So this is where I do something additional. First thing I do is I check for the HX trigger. Then, oh yeah, the HX trigger. So this is one of the headers that we talked about earlier. Why am I looking for the HX trigger? So if you remember, the HX trigger is the element that's triggering this HTMX request, is the ID of that element. So what I've done in the template, you'll notice, I'm going to bring up the template now. Notice that this div ID, this whole element here is that card that you see. This ID actually corresponds to the artist ID. And the ID is just, think of it as the database primary key. That's what the ID corresponds to here. So now, when a user clicks on this element, this ID is sent back to the route. It's sent back to the route. So now I have the artist ID from within that card here in the back end, and I make a database call based on that ID. So now that I have that artist, I'm changing the template now to this profile template, which is in the artist profile directory. And this just defines what that profile looks like within the card. So you can make it look however you want. You could style it different. I try to keep a similar style. But you'll notice that here is that get profile method or function that we pass through. I'm passing in the artist. I'm using safe because I wanted to generate if there's any HTML, and the get website. So the more info should populate with the website of the artist. So if I were to go to explosions in the sky and hit more info, you'll notice that it takes me there to their website, right? And then going back to the routes. So once we've defined the template, the artist, this find method sends a list, but it should only find one person, so, or yeah, one artist. So I am populating the context for artist with this one artist. So now my template response includes the template, which is going to be either the catalog HTML if a user navigates directly to this endpoint, or the artist profile HTML if it's an HX request. So that's the response. And the context will be this entire thing. And I'm going to create a new element for this context, which is just artist, singular, that contains the artist, so that I can then get the profile info for that particular element. And that's all it takes to produce this type of, and you'll notice the back button doesn't, maybe I just need to go back there. Oh no, how did I get an internal server error when I press back from one of the websites, which I fixed in a separate branch, and I'll show you how I fixed that. And there's a reason why it gives that error. But that's what happens. So that bit of code that you see there, just this one route, is what handles both the generation of this entire catalog page when someone clicks here, or the generation of the profile when someone clicks any one of these cards. So no JavaScript, no additional fancy stuff, just pretty straightforward HTML and Python. All right, any questions on what's happening there at all? Any confusion? We're good? All right, going to take a look at the search, and then we'll get our hands and try to tackle some of these things. So the search thing is interesting. We have a get request when someone actually clicks on the search bar, and then we have obviously the post request. So in Fast API, we can define the get request with router.get, and here's the search endpoint. So this, what I wanted it to do is I just wanted it to go ahead and populate all the artists when a user clicks into that search element. So again, we're populating this artist object with all the items, and we're sending some of that same stuff. But I'm also including this Boolean here from search, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I also have this thing called block name. So this is the Jinja2 blocks thing. But first things first, we are looking at, actually I don't even think I'm using this block name in this instance. I think I was building towards something, and you'll notice that I define a block name, but I never, oh no, I do redefine it here, sorry. So all I'm doing is, if someone navigates to search on their own, it does one thing. If they are generating it through an HX request, then I'm defining that block name merely to the content. So that's where that's happening. So again, navigating specifically to search would be something like this. And it's the same thing, it just generates search results. But if I'm here in the About page and I click up here, this is actually, as soon as I click up here, this is going to be an HX request. And this fancy hover stuff is all Tailwind stuff. So you can see kind of the dynamic nature of things you could do even just with transitions and mouse over and stuff. So I'm going here. As soon as I click here, you'll notice that the search results pop in here. So that's an HX request. I can show you in the search.html. Actually, no, it's in the header.html that where I define the search box, which is one big SVG, I believe. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, it's this whole SVG here. Or maybe I haven't. Where's the 8? Maybe I haven't done it as. Yeah, this is it here. So this HX get is the HX call, the HTMX call. You'll notice that it has a target of content. So whenever this request is sent, it only or the DOM element to be replaced is the content, the block content. And additional item is I want to push the URL to true. This is another HX attribute. So what this does is when someone clicks on the search, you actually want it to populate here for history in the search bar. That doesn't always happen. Like for example, when I click on these, you notice that the URL doesn't change. So you have to think about whether you want to push the URL or not. There might be reasons you want to, there might be reasons you don't. I wouldn't want to push the URL when we're just toggling between the profile and members, but I might want to change it if I'm in the home page and I click search. I do want the search to populate there. So that's why you see that particular attribute here. So that this all is particularly for the input, for clicking on that input. But then you'll see that's that div ID there. But then you see that the input itself has the HX post method. Here's the HX trigger that I talked about. So there's a couple things that are happening and an HX target. So the HX post, it's sending a post request whenever someone comes to that endpoint. And the trigger is key up, changed, and delay. So you would have to have a key up, it needs to have changed, and there needs to be a delay of 500 milliseconds before it sends this post request. There's more info on some of the different triggers and things you can use in the HTMX website, so we'll look at those later. And the comma search is you can say, what that's supposed to be is in case someone hits enter, it'll actually run the search automatically instead of waiting for the 500 milliseconds. So if someone types quickly and hits enter, it'll do the search. And then the HX target means that this is the ID that's going to change. You'll notice that it's not, this ID doesn't even exist within this header.html because again, this is part of the template. If I were to go back to the templates now and look at search, actually I think it's under catalog. No, here it is. So this is the div ID here of search results. So this element is the one that will populate when someone does start searching, which is pretty neat because these are, again, you don't have to build a whole new template or anything. It's all happening here. And what you see here is basically if there's if the search is a list, then for result in results, then type in that name, else for result in results. I'm trying to remember what I'm sending here, so let me look at my route. Search. I'm actually, did I end up using catalog instead? You know what? I ended up using catalog instead for the Jinja 2 blocks. You also notice in this catalog, one thing I noticed was if my search results are only going to be cards similar to what they appear in the catalog, can't I just create a new block that basically says if this is from the search endpoint, populate the search elements here, or if this is from the catalog, do it this way. So that's where you see in this template, I'm using the Jinja2 fragments, which can specify which items to render based on what triggered the response. So notice that that context had from search is true. So now I can say if it's not from search, do this one thing, else populate the search results. So now I can have my catalogs ordinarily here and my search results down here. And I think that's kind of how this piece was done. Because initially I had separated out the search. Now I'm trying to remember if I did that in a separate branch or not. Yeah, because look, over here I'm just sending the catalog.html under the search get, and I think also under the search post. So I'm not even using that search.html file at all. What I'm doing is, if there's a block, if it's an HX request, I'm saying only generate the content block when someone clicks search, and only generate the artist card block when it's a post request. So that's pretty useful because you're no longer having to split out separate files. I think I built the search.html file to kind of show the difference of what it would look like. It might work for your workflow. Sometimes you might want to separate things out just to keep things straight, putting them in directories, especially if you have a certain workflow that you already use with templates. Otherwise, having just, for me, having just one template file that looks at the state of things and generates that way makes it easier for me. And that's it. So then the post request is here. We looked at the HTML already, and it's pretty similar to what we've seen before. We're generating all artists, and let's see. Then we're doing, so this is just the database call. So again, if you're using any database, you do some sort of find or search or however you're using. The search key is going to be name, and the value is the search. So that search corresponds to the user input. So each key up with the 500 millisecond delay is going to populate the search. So now each time that post request is sent, we're finding the list of artists that matches that search, and then those are the artists that get sent to the template, and then they generate into this artist card. And that's how we now see them on here when I just start typing H. Those are all the bands that have an H in their name, or if I was looking for a specific Japanese composer, then there you go. And that resets. Those are the some of the more straightforward HTMX type of examples I have. Now we have about an hour and 15 minutes to work on some of these issues. And there's a secret, well, not a secret. If you've gone to the repo, you might have noticed there's a separate branch called additional features, I believe. Some of the answers to those issues are there in that branch. If you like to work backwards, I do a lot of times. I like to see how something works and then kind of deconstruct. You can go to that branch to see how some of these things are solved and work that way. Or if you want to try to give it a go, there in the routes.py are some to-do items under each one of those functions, as well as in the repo there's some issues that are either similar, or I think there might be one that's separate, There's some that are marked good first issue. Those I believe might be a little easier to tackle. And there's some more complex things. After, let's say, after about half an hour, we'll take a really short break and I'll demo what those additional features look like, and then we can finish off working to get yours up to speed as well. If you opened up in a code space, you might need to do a git fetch all sort of thing to get that additional branch on there. If you have issues with that, just let me know. But again, I want us to kind of take a look at those issues. Any questions so far? We're doing good? Excellent. All right, I'm going to put on some music. All right, how's it going? Some of you are getting there. While you keep working, I do want to kind of show you some of the things that you can build towards. You can continue working. I just want to make sure we have time to get to some of these. So give me one moment. What I've done is I'm opening up, and I'll put it up on the screen in a moment. I'm opening up the additional features branch. Just give me one moment. Okay. So now I have, let me make this bigger. This is the, oh, it might not be the right branch. I used the wrong. Oh, I'm running too many. I need to close one of these, that's why. All right, just give me a second. I wanted to make sure we all have a sense of what we can build towards, and I'm seeing, the good thing is I'm seeing some different ways to approach some of these, which is good. Why is this not? I might just have to open this up from, okay. Here we go. So as I mentioned, the data that I get from, that I'm using comes from the Discogs API. And because of that, sometimes I run into this thing. I wanted to show a lot of images on the screen, but sometimes I would hit the rate limit, and then it would give a not found error. So hopefully I don't run into too much of that now. I think since we're all working off of different containers, it won't bombard them, so hopefully that works. But if you see anything odd, that might be part of it. But let me get this running really quick. I started the wrong code space. All right, here we go. So I'll show you the front end experience first. This should have the randomized button working so that only the image updates. This would be important in cases where you might have a lot of content on a web page and you don't want a full refresh. You don't get that kind of jittery feeling. So if I press randomize, it's really only randomizing this image here. You can see it's pretty snappy. And again, these aren't even local images. This is actually hitting a URL and bringing the image and adding it in here. So it's pretty quick. So that's one piece there. Another to do was Oh, yes.
Just a quick question. When we swap the outer HTML of that element, is it possible to add a transition so that it fades?
You can use CSS transitions, yes. So, and that is one question that you get a lot with HTMX is, can you make it look a little bit smoother with the transitions? But yes, using CSS transitions, some of them are already predefined. You don't have to do much else other than give it that attribute in the HTML. That's a good question. The About page, when you click in it, you'll see that it does give you the URL up here, but all I've really changed is the content here. So you can see how this might even start looking like a single page application. You can create a shell and you're only changing elements within the application. It's still not technically a single page application, but it can function that way. Each one of these can be set to only refresh the content. And again, we see that even when you select search, that it only populates what you need to populate here. One of the to-do items was to be able to select one of these, and then when you click back, it brings back the members. So now it acts as a toggle, so you can see each time that you're doing that, you're sending a GET request to the server, but it's only updating the information that it needs each time. Another item that we talked about was the, I think those were the pieces we're checking. I do want to show something really cool. So one situation you may run into when you have, let's say, a lot of images, and you're working with one of these server-side rendering type of situations. You want to populate a lot of images, but you don't want to have to load them all before your page comes into view, right? So one thing that we can do with HTMX is we can create a load more button. So you only populate a certain amount, you load more, it keeps loading. But even cooler than that is you can just have a trigger that when an element comes into view, into the viewport, it loads a next set of elements. And then as you're scrolling, it starts populating div elements after the one that you just populated. So when I click on the detail link here, which is new in the additional features branch, you'll notice that it brings up an image, a name, and you'll see the scroll bar right here, right? This scroll bar should only have populated enough for a few bands. But notice it starts getting bigger as I start scrolling down. Because what's happening is when it reaches a certain element into view, it sends a GET request to populate the next element. So now, when you come to the details page, you're not loading a bunch of images that then you have to scroll down to see. You're only loading them as you need them, as someone is scrolling down. Notice they keep, the scroll bar keeps popping up, right? Ella Jenkins sings a lot of children's music, so that's why she's on here as well. My 4-year-old was here earlier. Notice it keeps getting bigger, right? And I still have not, I haven't hit any sort of snag, right? Just keeps growing. I think it's a really cool feature when you're dealing with a lot of data, or even if you, let's say you're from the data side and you have these huge models. There's different ways that you can interact with the visualization, loading things as you need them. Again, you could use a similar method. You get to the bottom, load more, or load next, those types of things. I think it's a pretty useful feature. I mean, I was super excited just to get this thing working. Now, one thing that you have to think about is how do you anticipate what to load next, and what do you do when you get to the very end? I think initially, when I had built this, when I got to the end, it would create some sort of error because the GET request kept looking for the next item and didn't know what to find. But there's ways that you can deal with that on the Python side, right? You know how to handle exceptions. You know how to handle different sets of data. You can get all the way to the very end, which is here, and we're done, right? And one thing that you'll notice with the kinds of data that's on each one of these, like I mentioned, since this comes from a API that has inconsistent data, some bands might have Wikipedia entries, but some don't. So that's all handled through Python again. I'm seeing if there's a link that contains Wikipedia on it, and if not, then I just don't display it. You notice that it doesn't create any sort of visual error. I've only, on the HTML side, I've only coded one detail card. That's it. I haven't created a huge HTML file out of this. We just have one template that's iterating over all these artist dictionaries and populating the information as needed. Some of these bands have additional images, so I could potentially add additional HX requests that allow me to click through and see all the images associated with the band members. That's something I haven't done in this particular case, but you can see how it starts looking a lot more dynamic as you start building it out. And again, everything that we've done so far is either in the HTML or in Python. We haven't needed to do much else outside of configuring our Tailwind. I was going to wait a little bit longer to look at some additional pieces of customizations that you can do within Tailwind and HTMX, but I think we might as well get to them so I don't miss out on speaking about that. So we've tackled some repository issues. I had an extra credit here I forgot about. You can add keyboard shortcuts as triggers. So you can make your web application function almost like a web app. You could do like Control-S for search, or you could make different kinds of modifiers to keyboard shortcuts so people could interact with your website. It could be a really cool thing to do, so maybe try that out in your spare time. But one thing you may think about when you're building with predetermined classes, as is the case with Tailwind, is what do you do when you need a little bit more customizability? And Tailwind does allow you to create your own custom CSS classes, so you can define those yourself. And then you can also provide your own color scheme. So you saw those that are already predefined for red and blue and fuchsia. There's so many. But you know, we all want to be unique butterflies. So sometimes we may want to create our own sorts of color palettes, and we can name them however we want. So it allows you to do that. You can also use custom and pre-built components. There's a paid element to Tailwind CSS if you want to pay for these very professional looking elements that you just don't want to build yourself. But then you can then customize them once you've used them. So that's pretty great. And then what's also pretty great about Tailwind is it provides these specific breakpoints when you're building. I haven't showcased a lot of that in what I've built so far, but you can set you build with mobile first design, and then you set breakpoints, and all you have to do is use say MD for medium screen size, MD colon, and then provide all the classes that apply to that breakpoint and larger. And same thing with large, LG colon, everything past that would be customized. So a lot of stuff you can do there. What you would want to do is here's an example of a custom class within that directives file that we saw. So what you're doing is you're calling in that components layer, which is one of the layers used during the build process or compilation process, and you're creating your custom button. So now in your HTML, instead of having to type in px2, py1, bgblue, rounded, text slate 200, now all you have to do is put in custom button, and it'll do all of that for you. So that might reduce the verbosity of the HTML element. Some people might like to do that. Also, you could just straight up code a custom CSS class within that directives. You just would not add it to the component layer, you would just code a straight up CSS property, just like you're used to. So the equivalent of that piece that we saw up here, so the equivalent of that in CSS looks like this. They're both doing the same thing. And you would call them the same way within your HTML. You would either do custom button or custom buttoner. And they do the exact same thing. They're just written differently. And I could get into it, but it matters in terms of how things are layered in the cascading sheet. It can get a little bit more down the rabbit hole with that. This is how you would do that if you wanted to build your own custom classes that you can then call within your HTML elements. And again, forget about the compiled CSS class file, because you wouldn't need to worry about it. A custom color palette would look a little bit like this. So in that tailwind.config file that we saw, that's at the root of your project, you might have an extension. So you would extend the available colors. And then you would add, these are just an example, you could add a primary color. So then in your HTML, you would just say class equals class bg-primary, and it would always be that color. So that way, if you're developing with a mindset of primary, secondary type colors, you just call that in your class, and you already know what color scheme you're using. If you wanted to define your own palette, like we see with the slate or some of those other colors, here's an example of how you could do that. Here's a turquoise color palette, and each one of these levels would be defined at each one of these hex codes. How do I get my own color palette? There's a lot of cool generators online for Tailwind color palette generator that you can type in red, and it kind of gives you a whole slew of these. And then you just pretty much copy paste them into this config file. Again, this allows for that kind of customization you might need if you're being very specific about the colors you need to use. Let's say you're working with a design team and they're telling you what colors you need to use, then this is kind of how you would do it. Additionally, I don't know if I have it on the slide. Yeah, so this is how you would call the primary color for your text, for example. Instead of having to do text-bg or text slate, whatever, you just call the primary color. But I did want to point out, I think I didn't put a slide on this, but there's also a way that you can define, let me make this bigger. Let me make sure I have it in here. In that same directives file, if you're in the additional features repo and you look at the static source TW file, what you'll notice in here is I'm also defining a separate font. So you'll notice that the font that I'm using here actually looks a little different than what you saw initially. Let's say you don't want to use your system fonts, you want to use your own font. So I downloaded this font called Livic, and you define it just like you would in a CSS file. Again, this is in that directives file. I'm creating font face properties for each of the font weights I think I'm going to use. And then in my config file, so this is a two-step process for fonts. You put them in your directive file, and then in your config file, you need to state that you're going to use a font family called Livic. I could name this A, B, C, D, whatever I want to. This is going to be the name that you use. This is the class that's associated with this font. So now you can use Livic within your templates. If you look at I think I put it in the base. Did I put it in here somewhere? Yeah, see, I define the font for the entire page to be Livic. So now everything is generating with that font. That's if you want to use custom fonts. So it's all possible. There are a lot more customizations you can do, and that's all available there on the Tailwind CSS website. It's amazing the kinds of things you can do. And I do also want to talk about HTMX. One question I got asked previously when I was talking about this topic with a group of people was, is HTMX production ready? That's like the main question. Now, the advantage you have here is that you have no outside dependencies, outside of your Python dependencies. All you need is a file and your static assets, right? The vanilla JavaScript file we saw. It's significantly less complex than a SPA approach, a single page application. You're not dealing with any front-end framework and having to have two different states. And it's perfect for any back-end technology. We work in Python, but you could use it with any back-end technology. So if you're comfortable in your back-end technology, you're comfortable with HTMX. But does that answer the question, is it production ready? Can I depend on it? Now, what I would say is I'm just a lowly business analyst that dabbles with Python at night. So you wouldn't have to take my word for it. But I would recommend watching this video that's online from DjangoCon Europe 2022. It's called From React to HTMX on a Real-World SaaS Product. We did it, and it's awesome. It's this company called Context. And I will have this link available to you here at the end. The YouTube it's not even all that long, but I want to highlight some of these things that, you know, their team. I think their team was a team of 4 developers, 1 JavaScript developer, 3 Python developers. They work in Django. They actually went from having a fully functional React website to an HTMX and Django only product, or mostly product. They made no UX compromises, so they kept all the UI that the users were used to. They reduced their code base from 21,500 lines of code to 7,100 lines of code. That is a drastic reduction in lines of code, period. They reduced their web build time from 48 to 5 seconds. So that's huge increase in productivity there. Their first load time to interactive was reduced by around 50 to 60%. So you can imagine all that JavaScript that's kind of in the way during that first time to load. I'm sure helps a lot with SEO and that kind of stuff. You're getting an immediate response. And their company deals with very large data sets. They found, I put data sets instead of data sets, but they found that they had larger data sets that were possible with an HTMX application as opposed to React. And they lost their JavaScript developer. So they went from 4 developers to 3, which is, you know, it is a huge cost-cutting benefit to them as a company, and also no need for additional resources to understand the JavaScript. So again, I highly recommend that DjangoCon Europe talk. It's on it's on YouTube, but I'll link it to you in a moment. And let's see. I believe my playlist, in case you wanted to hear some of the music you've been hearing around today, and that you have in, it's one song from each of the artists that's in my music binder application. This is the playlist here. Again, I'll also give you a place to find that afterwards. And lastly, we still have about 15 minutes. If you have some questions, I can come around. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I worked really hard to have something that at least I was excited about. I hope that at the very least it starts spurring some imagination, some different ways to think about how you build your web applications. Again, it's not an either or proposition. I definitely don't want to learn JavaScript, but if some of you find that you might find any benefit, like the people over at DjangoCon. here, but if you go to pythonbynight.com, and then up at the top, there's some links up there. There's one that's called Talks. If you click on that link, there should be right at the top a reference to this tutorial here. I have a lot of resources there that we talked about today, in addition to the links to the playlist and all that stuff. I also have a version of this repo that's a more step-by-step guide to getting to this stage. It's called Simple Site, not very creative there, but that repo has documentation that talks about how you're building your routes with Fast API, how the templates work, and so on. That might also prove helpful if you felt like this was going a little too quick and you kind of wanted to build it yourself from scratch. You have a little bit more time, then that's also there. And if you have any questions, you can reach me on Mastodon. There's my handle. I'll be around all week. Hopefully, I'll see some of you. And like I said, I might open up an open space later during the week so we can do some other cool things. So that's all from up here. I'm going to walk around. If you have any questions or if you feel like you've had enough, you're ready to go, that's cool as well. Thank you all.